Small modular nuclear reactors are often talked about as a future technology, but a lot is already happening right now. I'm joined today by Magnus Mori and Rachel Johnson from Urenco to unpack uranium enrichment, fuel supply, and why advanced nuclear power is ultimately a question of infrastructure and governance, not just technology. In September, I published a video on this channel looking at small modular nuclear reactors, what they are, where the industry currently stands, and why they're increasingly part of serious energy and climate discussions around the world. That video continues to attract a lot of interest, which tells me that there's a real appetite for moving beyond slogans and into the practical realities of small modular reactors. As a reminder, small modular reactors are those with an electrical generating capacity of up to 300 megawatts that lend themselves towards prefabricated construction and whose residual heat can be used in locations where there is also a thermal load. Today, I want to take that discussion a step further. I'm joined by Magnus Mori and Rachel Johnson from Urenco Limited, one of the world's largest uranium enrichment companies and a critical supplier to the global nuclear electricity industry. Urenco sits at a very specific and often under-discussed part of the nuclear value chain, and that is the fuel cycle. That gives it a unique vantage point on what is and is not realistic when it comes to the future deployment of small modular reactors. In this conversation, we'll focus less on hype and more on industry development, timelines, scale, fuel requirements, economics, and the practical constraints that will shape whether small modular reactors can move from promise to widespread deployment. Well, welcome, Magnus and Rachel. Thank you very much for joining me today on Climate Mundial's Energy and Climate Weekly. And I wondered, as a beginning point, if I could ask you both to introduce yourselves, to let the audience know a little bit more about the way that you entered the nuclear energy industry, and also tell us a little bit more about your current positions in the firm and the sort of work that you're engaged in doing.
Well, hello, Daniel and everyone, and thanks for chatting with us today. So I actually studied mechanical engineering and did a year specializing in renewable energy, which isn't really how it led to my nuclear career, but worth mentioning. I have looked in that space, but I've spent about 15 years now in the nuclear industry. So I began my career at Torness Nuclear Power Plant. It's part of the Electricité de France, or EDF portfolio, which is on the east coast of Scotland. And it's one of the few remaining advanced gas reactors today. So that was my start. After a number of years of really focusing on technical and just operating of the nuclear power plant, I wanted to do more, something a little more strategic around energy solutions. So I had the opportunity to move into a role focusing really on what do the license sites in the UK, where do they go after the AGR is shut down? So I did that for a few years, looking at how we could deploy SMRs, hydrogen production, fusion, sort of innovative technologies for energy at EDF. And then about 11 years into my career with EDF, I had the opportunity to move to Urenco. And this is really where I began to see the front end of the supply chain. So up to now, really being focused on gigawatt scale production, electricity generation. That was really the goal. And I moved to this role, which was the head of business development for advanced fuels. So really focusing on what are the new fuel products that Urenco can bring to the market to support the next generation of reactors. And fast forward to now, finally working for Magnus and in his team. And I'm Vice President of Advanced Fuels Sales geographically for the Middle East, Africa, Asia, Europe, and the UK. And although it's a sales role, it's really about advocating for advanced technologies. This is a new market. So really supporting that market, the new entrants, and ultimately promoting, this technology, advanced technologies, and the sale of enriched uranium. So that's a whistle-stop tour of my career. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you, Rachel. And Magnus, could you please do the same for us?
I don't even know where to start from, Daniel. I would say I've always been fascinated with nuclear energy. I remember being maybe 7 or 8 year old boy at home in Italy and seeing a documentary about the Corso nuclear power plant that was coming online, and I saw the blue radiation of the Cherenkov's radiation, and I was just mesmerized by it and by the fact that that radiation is caused by radiation that travels faster than light. And I thought nothing can travel faster than light, and hence the radiation, because that those particles and that radiation needs to slow down quickly, and therefore emits that blue light. Fast forward to many years later, when I had to choose what to do at uni, I chose nuclear engineering, and then after that, my career has moved from place to place. As you know, Daniel, we met about 20 years ago. I realized when we were doing work, with the UN on climate change and sustainable development, I've always wanted to be involved in nuclear power plant construction, operations, and I was lucky for 10 years to do that with E.ON in Germany, where I was involved with the UK new build projects, the Italian attempt to restart a nuclear program in the mid 2000s, and then after Fukushima, there's been a paradigm shift, especially in Italy and Germany, and I was lucky at that point when Urenco knocked on my door, and Urenco was also going through civil restructuring and refocusing of their priorities, and I also joined in a commercial role. And finally, about 5 years ago, Urenco had the foresight to see how SMRs were becoming more and more important for the nuclear ecosystem, and decided eventually to create a dedicated team that is looking at how do we enable the fuel supply chain for SMRs. And I think it's now the third year in my tenure leading that team, and it's been a privilege. It hasn't been without challenges, but it's definitely been a lot of fun.
Great. Thank you very much, Magnus. And that's actually a great point of departure then into the broader topic for today's discussion, because we are actually keen to talk about small modular reactors. So on that note, and profiting really from the fantastic expertise that we have across the two of you available today, I'd like to ask maybe initially a first question, because when I guess in the public discourse about small modular reactors, there's a lot of discussion about the technology itself, but people rarely talk about the fuel requirements for small modular reactors. And I wondered, coming from the perspective of Urenco and being involved in the fuel preparation business, I wondered if you could just speak a little bit about the requirements of a small modular reactor in terms of the enriched uranium, and whether or not it's a given that the supply side will actually be ready to cater to the needs of small modular reactors, or whether further work is needed. So maybe on that note, we could perhaps begin with Rachel, and then Magnus, if you'd like to opine on that particular question.
Thanks, Daniel. I mean, fuel, extremely important. Where just in the AMR SMR space, our team, as Magnus said, is new in the grand scheme of things, and we started with not knowing who was out there, and we've come to know so many potential customers, stakeholders, different designs, different fuel requirements. So we've had to do a lot of education to those new market entrants on really understanding where they're at, but also then educating them on the fuel supply chain. Even out with just enrichment, try and say, you need to work back from your fabricator. What are your quantities, requirements, timelines, and that kind of thing. I think, for the audience, who aren't maybe up to speed on, nuclear and the technical needs of fuel, if you were planning on mass production of a new car, you would need to know where your fuel supply was coming from. You've considered that up front. I think in some respects, this new market do think that the fuel's just there. They take it for granted. So we've been doing a lot of that education piece. We're trying to also gather customers, not just their first of a kind. When do they plan to bring their first reactor online to prove the technology works, and what are those requirements? But also, what are their ambitious rollout plans for growth? Because they do, a lot of these developers have huge, ambitious development plans, and so we need to think about the potential fuel. So we're trying to gauge what that is and what their growth strategy is, and then just understand what's realistic with our experience and our background in this. So at Urenco, brilliant history on delivery to customers. We've never missed a delivery. So for us, it is about growing with the market, but at a realistic pace. Magnus, we can talk some more to this, but during the design of a reactor, the type, quality, quantity of fuel is crucial information to the success of that reactor. So it has to be considered hand in hand, and we're seeing more of that now. And although the mature market hasn't arrived yet, so we're in the space trying to understand, are these timelines realistic? Are these quantities realistic? We have to be ahead of it. We have to be ahead of the curve, and we need to be ready for these reactors when they need their fuel. So part of this chicken and egg conundrum, making these large investments in the private sector in the supply chain before the market's there and mature, Urenco have proudly co-invested with the UK government to bring to life part of that chicken and egg problem. So the first commercial Western HALEU supply at our UK facility in 2031, and that that has really helped the momentum of things, helped the market to move forward. So I'll leave it there for a minute and just see if there's if you have a question or for Magnus to add on.
I liked a couple of references you made, Rachel, to our industry, but also you mentioned AMRs, SMRs. That's maybe, that's an important distinction, Daniel. So there's a lot of definitions out there. SMRs, small modular reactors, can be interpreted as any reactor that is smaller or around 300 megawatt electric in output. There's other definitions where SMRs are more similar to current large-scale reactors. They're just smaller, but they use the same technology. And for that reason, there's also this new acronym, which is AMR, Advanced Modular Reactor, which is a modular reactor that is small, but uses advanced technologies and usually advanced fuels. So where's the parallel with the car industry? In a way, you could say you have cars, i.e. reactors that use diesel, or some of them use gasoline or petrol, depending on what kind of English you speak. And some of them may be plug-in hybrids or mild hybrids. So there's a whole suite of technical solutions. Now, I'm not mentioning EVs because that I don't think works well in this analogy. The reality is that whether it's a diesel or a petrol car or a hybrid, you need oil that comes from somewhere that needs to be refined specifically for those cars' needs. So just continue on that analogy. For us, you always start with uranium. Even the most advanced reactors that are thinking about using plutonium or recycling fuel, they still need some uranium at the start. And then you have the whole nuclear fuel supply chain that processes and refines, if you will, or in our case, enriches that uranium. And the way you enrich it or how much you enrich it requires different investments and different infrastructure. Hence Rachel's reference to our high acid alloy enriched uranium investment in the UK.
Great. And I just want to, I think that's really important for the audience, to know and understand that there are these different definitions, small modular reactors. I did an episode on that topic back in September, but knowing about AMRs as well is very important for the audience. In general, though, given the differences between small modular reactors and advanced modular reactors from more traditional technologies, obviously the small modular reactors hold this promise of being smaller, potentially able to be fabricated off-site and then essentially taken to site and installed rather quickly, dealing with a lot of the construction time lags that have maybe been difficult to manage on some larger scale projects. But if you look at the drive that's going on to develop, whether it be small modular reactors or advanced modular reactors in the current climate, how would you characterize the main drivers for these developments? Is it that people are realizing that the zero emission capabilities of these technologies really is important in the context of the drive towards dealing with climate change and having zero emission electricity generation sources? Or is there something else as well driving it, perhaps like diversification of fuel supply mixes, energy security, reliability? So I guess the question is, what do you think are the real drivers that are channeling people in the market towards things like small modular reactors and advanced modular reactors?
I can take that one to start off with, Daniel, if you like. But
Fantastic.
The growing emphasis, I think, what we see has been energy security. Of course, there are the other elements about clean energy requirements and increased demand in general for heat and power. But I think that energy security, that national domestic supply availability is a driver here. All of them, let's say, the next generation of reactors, the small AMRs, and can offer cheaper, safer in some cases, and more affordable, investable power for electricity and heat generation at a constant, reliable baseline. It's when I say it out loud, I'm just like, right, it's so sellable. But what we need to see to get to that point, as you mentioned, is we need to see these proven technologies. And some of the timelines of the first movers, perhaps in North America, once we start to see that proof of concept, I think the investability will very quickly follow behind, and then the mass factory modular production. And that's when you'll see products being produced rather than large construction nuclear projects. I think ultimately it's lots of energy at a lower cost, and it needs to be deployed fast. If you look at the history of large scale nuclear projects, bar a couple, they're very lengthy projects. And if we're looking at national energy security, these countries need to move fast to a place where they have that baseline reliable power.
One example, and it's something that it's a trend that everybody talks about almost every day, is AI and the energy needs of AI. That's just one example. And I'm using that example because it is driving electricity demand, and it is driving electricity demand that needs, as Rachel was saying, reliable, investable solutions for 24/7. In fact, extremely high requirements on availability and reliability of the supply to data centers. That's just one example of one of the new trends that, and one of these energy demand drivers that would be very difficult to be supplied with just purely with renewables, or even renewables plus storage solutions. So that's one aspect. Energy security was mentioned, energy independence, climate commitments. You mentioned it, Daniel, and we also see, just to mention one example, that is a combination of the needs for diversification and security and reliability. I'm just going to mention the demonstration projects in the US, the Dow Seadrift project between Dow and X Energy, where for the first time we have a nuclear reactor co-located with a chemical facility, and the main purpose of that reactor will be to deliver heat, not electricity. So there will be electricity as well as part of the mix, but that's something that we're observing now, especially with advanced modular reactors, and it is a paradigm shift.
And on that note, I'd like to maybe then pick up on the stage of technology development, and obviously we've got some demonstration projects underway, particularly in the US, also some other countries around the world. Thinking about then what it's going to take once the proof of concept is there, and it can be used not just for electrical energy generation, but also, as you mentioned, thermal use connected to chemical plants and other types of thermal load. We've seen with other technologies, in particular like solar PV and wind, manufacturers of those technologies have been able to do very well at getting their cost curves, reducing their cost curves of production, because they've been able to achieve scale that has come from the development of demand side pull type policies like feed-in tariffs, renewable energy targets, certificate programs, and so forth. We don't really hear much at the moment, at least, about the sorts of policies that could be put into place to really pull through some of these technologies from the small modular reactor or advanced modular reactor technologies. I guess what I'd like to do now is maybe ask your opinion, what you think would be optimal policies to really assist, and also when you think those policies are going to be needed, given the state of technological development that we currently see in the market, thinking about this transition between proof of concept and then into something that's scalable and is able to deliver these cost reductions over time, in the same way that we've seen happen in some of these other renewable technologies and others. And maybe on that note, I'll begin by asking that question to you, Magnus, and then we'll go to Rachel after that.
Not an easy question, Daniel. I think, so before we address the policy and what policies would enable scalability, what we definitely see today is more short-term policies that are incentivizing demonstration. And I think by and large, these are working well, maybe not as quickly as some developers would hope. But we have, for instance, Great British Nuclear Energy in the UK, just to mention the UK first. In the US, we have the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program. We have different national initiatives for the fuel supply chain. We also have initiatives that are more climate target related, and I'm thinking specifically about Canada, for instance. And all of these are driving early movements, early demonstration projects or industrial projects, and I'm thinking specifically about OPG, Ontario Power Generation, is building. They started nuclear construction of an SMR in Ontario, and it's the GE Hitachi BWRX 300 that is being built right now. So that's what is happening today, and it is already having a positive effect. Then going back to your real question is how do we go from this to scalability? What I see and what we see as a team and as an industry is that we have a few developers that are relatively new, don't have the pedigree of, let's say, GE Hitachi, just to mention them. And they're already thinking about scalability from the start. Also because they're acting as disruptors. They're not thinking about selling electricity or delivering electricity to the grid. They're working directly with hyperscalers or with high energy needs from end users. And I think my vision anyway is that it's going to be some of these non-traditional applications and some of these non-traditional, if you will, customers and the developers that will find solutions that will then inform policy. I can be more specific, but I'll leave it at that, also to give a chance to Rachel to comment.
That is a tough question. I think well, we're going back to Europe for a second. A little slower behind the curve, behind North America. The European Commission decided to run a program, SMR Alliance, so bringing together industry, moving industry forward. So that's been very positive. I think then the next stage of that is looking at exactly, what are the policies to enable this, and what are the financial mechanisms? To start off, the support is required from government or a union, as such that financial support is required, that policy drive from government, like we've seen in the US, really cutting through how do we speed up things a little bit. Traditionally in the nuclear industry, it's been a slow moving beast. And to really see this scale at the pace we need to see a bit more speed, but still done in a really safe way. So I think that there's a lot of collaboration going on between, there is a lot of collaboration going on between at least the US, Canadian, and UK regulators on how to regulate these new technologies quickly, and get a standardized approach as much as possible. So I think that will be a real driver when we can nail that regulatory approach. You hear this a lot in these discussions around aircraft licensing, a little different, of course, but, you license an aircraft in one country and then it's kind of globally accepted or accepted in other nations. There needs to be a bit of that, I think, for scalability as well. So just summarizing those couple of points, definitely strong government financial investment in those first of a kind, trying to bring it to life, because I think then the investors, as Magnus mentioned, and private investors, end users, will take that leap forward. They already are. So financial and then just standardization as much as we can within this industry.
That's a really interesting point, Rachel, because, when one does look at airlines and airplanes, if one were to, before considering that example, be reasonably pessimistic about the prospects of international collaboration on technical standards like that, the airline example and the airplane example does actually provide some inspiration, in a sense that that type of cooperation is possible. So I'm really glad that you've mentioned that. And if we look sort of across the board at the potential demand side of the marketplace, we've talked a little bit about the United States, also Europe, Canada, and so forth. But are there any other markets that you think are expressing a lot of interest in these advanced technologies, or SMR technologies in particular, that are also aligning to the levels of ambition, if you like, that we're seeing in the US, Europe, and also Canada, and ones that you think are worth mentioning in the context of a discussion like this?
I think, just with my geographical stretch, obviously there's, as you said, tiered priorities of who's moving at what pace. So US and then Europe, UK. But we're seeing a lot of traction from Asia, South Korea, then, the Philippines, Indonesia, those kind of, that cluster of countries. So a combination between existing nuclear players and new entrants. That really, I think they want to be part of it. Certainly, the South Korean companies, they have a lot of appetite to see the market grow globally.
Yes.
So seeing a lot of that, new entrants following behind, the need just for energy, and economic growth and stability, and then kind of linked with that, I would say Africa. They really have this appetite. They've got an interesting political culture, which offers a few challenges, but really seeing a lot of collaboration there. I've not worked in that space very much up until now, but we're really seeing these countries come together, thinking about how they can achieve bipartisan constant support for nuclear, for example, and how do they get support from well-established nuclear countries, and where can there be international collaboration to see this as a global success. So I'll leave it there, but definitely seeing momentum globally.
Fantastic. And that's an interesting point, which maybe I'll throw to you, Magnus, about some of the work that you and I did all those years ago on the United Nations side of things, was focused on this concept of technology transfer. And Rachel's mentioned Africa. I suppose also we could maybe mention Latin America and places like that, where there is really a great opportunity, to the extent that there are countries that are able to move this technology forward, then obviously looking for more demand around the world. How do you see it, Magnus? Do you think technology transfer and these opportunities to deploy technology in the long run in developing markets is a key area? Do you agree with that proposition?
I like the idea a lot. I think we have a great example, and Rachel mentioned in South Korea, just reminded me of the success that, if you allow me the expression, the South Korean nuclear establishment had in the United Arab Emirates, with the Baraka project, where they did a technology transfer, where perhaps, if you allow me, it may be a little provocative, but because the UAE did not have an established nuclear infrastructure, they were very open to accepting the standards that those reactors came with. And of course, they established their own regulatory body, but there was a very productive and very organic approach to new build. And we see the results today with 4 reactors that there were a few delays, but they were not that significant. And they're now one of the leading countries in new build. And in fact, that model is used as a model for export for other countries. So I think, just thinking about Africa, South America already has a rich nuclear tradition, if you think about Argentina and Brazil especially. But I think there's more. It sounds, again, provocative and maybe like a paradox, but there's more potential for scale deployment, in my opinion, in those countries than in more established countries, because I think they can be leaner, they can be more receptive, and be possibly less prejudice, if you allow me the expression, about the country of origin technology characteristics and approach to safety. And on that topic, we're also seeing how, however, that developers are using more and more, for instance, IAEA safety standards as a design basis instead of their own countries as a starting point, because they have the exportability and that technology transfer challenge in mind.
That's very interesting. So I guess if I had thought about this prior to this discussion, I would have imagined that having an established nuclear industry already in place would perhaps be an advantage when one looks at these the small modular reactor technologies and so forth. But I guess what we're saying is that potentially that could become a constraint in some instances, and there may be some cases in which not having such an established industry already in place may actually be an advantage for, let's say, an emerging market that's looking to adopt the technology, the new generation technologies, and move forward. Would that be a reasonable thing to conclude?
Again, we've been provocative here. But there is, if you think about regulations, if until today you regulated a certain kind of technology and you try to develop a new technology within that framework, it becomes more challenging. And I'm not criticizing regulators, because if I think specifically about 3 regulators that Rachel mentioned earlier, ONR in the UK, CNSC in Canada, or the US NRC, they are cooperating and they are working really, really quickly to evolve their regulations to meet these new trends and these new demands of these new technologies. But I think if you have a system where you can start from a clean slate, I don't see that as an obstacle, let me put it that way.
Rachel, what about, I mean, in a country like Australia, for example, there isn't a legacy nuclear industry. And when nuclear technologies are proposed, counter side to the argument always mentions that it's a highly technical, highly complex industry, and there are, currently aren't any engineers or a fleet of engineers that can work on it, and so forth. And so basically capacity constraints in terms of personnel are often mentioned as a reason not to have an industry. What are your thoughts? I mean, I'm not speaking necessarily only about a country like Australia, but do you think those sorts of challenges, especially when we're talking about small modular reactors, can be overcome? Is there a pathway forward?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, it's something I was part of a team discussing in Africa recently, which I compared. They also worry about that pipeline of skills, and that maybe embedded nuclear culture, and how you build that up. I think agreeing with Magnus, I think there's an opportunity for these other countries to kind of observe what these developed countries are doing, maybe, work very closely with and adopt those first couple within country, using a real pull on those resources that exist in those countries, but also importantly tie in strong leadership and strategic vision on, as we're doing this, we need to be building our own resources, we need to be building our own skills. And I think what Magnus had mentioned on earlier is, policy again tied into education and how much focus is going to be put on that skill set, or those many skill sets. They need to kind of see the evidence of it first. And I think, you can start having that power, not necessarily with your own domestic supply chain skills and everything, but, it needs to be that balance and that strategic balance from the beginning, to know that you have the freedom to build and learn your own, let's say, nuclear infrastructure, and not be tied to a dominating technology that doesn't offer collaboration. So that was a long-winded answer, but I don't think you don't train experience without having practiced it. You can't just send everyone to university and hope they come out as nuclear operators necessarily. So it needs to be a bit of practiced learning. That's how I would say, and it will take a long time to build that skills pipeline, but it doesn't mean that you have to wait until it's fully established.
And on that note, I think what I'd like to do is both of you, what do you think are, you're working on a day-to-day basis in this area. You're seeing the state of technologies, you're understanding the fuel cycle constraints, you're working on those sorts of things. Your firm is making investments, and you're really part of the market. But you're probably also aware of the state of general public understanding about these technologies and the processes. If I could ask you each to describe, what do you think are the most important things for members of the general public to better understand about particularly small modular reactors that they may not already know, that would be helpful and beneficial to those working in the industry, so that the collaborations that we mentioned before become more possible and more feasible? Maybe I'll start, Magnus, with you.
I think if I think about my family, for instance, and my friends, there's this idea that small modular reactors are a thing of the future, that they're more of a promise. They're not a thing of the future, they're happening right now. Even advanced modular reactors, there are a few developers that are building, that are buying components, they're assembling, they're preparing for criticality tests. So they're into nuclear design. And there's a number of examples. I mentioned Dow X Energy in Texas, but mentioned OPG in Canada. Kairos Power is building in Tennessee right now. We have, especially in the US, but in Europe as well, we have developers that are doing active testing right now, preparing for construction. And I was personally also surprised to see and meet the engineers, the workforce, and actually see that they're building and that they have one-to-one replicas of the reactors. Obviously, they're not loaded with nuclear fuel yet, but they're testing everything and they're really ready to deploy. I'll say that it's, so just to then underline or repeat myself, the main message here is that it's real, it's happening.
Just that there's a lot of reactors out there. So yeah, there's a big hype, and I guess you'll have some people that think it's just a hype. But Magnus has highlighted some of the positives, so the realities we're seeing. I think that there will be some clear winners, and we'll start to see that at some point soon, and really start to see a consolidation of perhaps reactor companies coming together, fuel designs, just a lot of standardization there. We're starting to see a little bit of it already, but I think at that turning point, when we start to see those demonstrations, there will be some clear runner-ups, and then there's some longer term designs that need a bit more research and development, need a bit more work. But as Magnus said, it's happening. You see these programs, technologies have been selected in countries, technologies are being built in countries. You're starting with the light water reactor, so closest to what we know today, light water reactor technologies where we're using low enriched uranium, and then maybe slightly working our way up into the advanced technologies. It is happening.
That's fascinating. And so what we're really also seeing is that there's this work being done on the supply side, but there's reasonably intense competition. So there may be some players that are able to perfect the model, if you like, faster than others, and so it does provide the opportunity for there to be some early movers and some winners in the early stages. So that could be quite interesting, to keep a close eye on that, and something that viewers of this channel might also like to follow as well.
Yeah, and I think from that perspective, Daniel, we have different technologies and different developers that are targeting different markets.
Mm-hmm.
Also because of different energy needs. One major player that we've not mentioned yet is TerraPower, for instance, and their technology and the size of their reactor is really, really good, for instance, for deployment for coal repowering. So where you shut down a coal-fired plant of about 350 to 500 megawatts, and you replace it with an atrium reactor. So that's, for instance, one of the markets that they're looking at as at least for early demonstration. You have other reactors that are much smaller, somewhat portable. So there's a lot of early movers. There's definitely going to be some consolidation, but it's also early movers in different market segments.
The opportunity, if you like, to repower coal-fired power plants is ironically was the idea that the opposition had in Australia at the last election, was to literally substitute 6 or 7 power plants running on coal eventually with nuclear. So that was sort of the concept that was put forward. There was a lot of debate about whether the government was the right developer of those particular projects and all those other things that I mentioned before. But the concept of repowering coal-fired power plants using nuclear technology, whether that be small modular reactors, advanced modular reactors, or something else, does sound like quite an interesting opportunity, and certainly one to keep an eye on, across the world, not just in places like Australia, but other places that have become quite coal dependent over the years, to see what might be possible. Well, that's great. Thank you very much to both of you for the discussion. I guess before we wind up, is there any last remark that you think you'd like to make to the audience watching the video about the work that's being done on the industry side in these technologies?
Just a broad remark. We run a demand study over the summer, and we've been advertising the results for the last few months, just to give you a snippet of what the potential is. And under what we call the transformation scenario, which looks at that mass manufacturing and standardization approach that we mentioned before, we see a potential of 700 gigawatts of SMR deployment by 2050, which is a lot of gigawatts. If you think that nowadays the overall output of nuclear power is about half of that. So the potential is enormous, and we see that there's, through demonstrations, through all these steps that we talked about, we see that there's movement towards the realization of that potential.
Just always thinking that people need different sources to go and take their time and digest. When it comes to nuclear, there is a sort of website that's been launched called Nuclear for Good, and it's relatively new, but it's kind of bringing together loads of stories and experts from the nuclear industry to show how nuclear technology can benefit everyone in their day-to-day lives. We something else we do at Urenco is medical isotopes to support cancer therapies and treatments, diagnostics. So there's such a large suite of what nuclear can support with. So in terms of public perception and where we may like to be in the future, I think Nuclear for Good's a good source of information if anyone wants to go and touch base there. And our website obviously talks a lot about what Urenco do, and not just for energy production, but also for the medical sector. So yeah, I'll point people in that direction.
Fantastic, Rachel. Well, I'll make sure that the links to Nuclear for Good and also Urenco are placed into the description of this video, because they do sound like excellent resources. Well, on that note, I'd like to offer you both a very warm round of thanks on behalf of the audience and also on behalf of the channel, and hope that we can continue this discussion at some point in the future as the exciting elements of the development of these advanced nuclear technologies take shape around the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Daniel.
Well, that concludes the conversation with Magnus and Rachel. Let me know what you think about small and advanced modular reactors by making a comment below. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to click like. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to the channel. Thanks for your attention today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon in the next episode of Climate Mundial's Energy and Climate Weekly. Bye for now.